I'm a little bit disappointed with just how well the 6600U is able to perform. We've covered handhelds a whole lot of times here on the channel, and it's for good reason. With the latest generations of mobile CPUs and APUs hitting the market, 1080p gaming in a handheld device is no longer a stretch goal. It is now affordable as well as very realistic for the mainstream. Now, we've talked a lot about the high end of the spectrum, focusing more on AMD 6800U based processors and seeing how it goes toe-to-toe with the performance of the Steam Deck. But what about the low end? Today we're going to talk about just that and see if there's any other devices that you should pick up instead of the Steam Deck. Thanks to you guys coming back and watching the channel, I got quite a bit of AdSense money and we invested here on the channel and picked up the AMD 5800U inside of the One X Player Mini. This device features the AMD Ryzen 7 5800U. With 8 Zen 3 cores boosting up to 4.4 GHz, this little handheld has plenty of CPU power. However, the 5800U uses the poorly aged Vega 8 integrated GPU, with only 8 compute units boosting up to 2 GHz. With a configurable TDP between 10 and 25 watts, One X defaults this unit to 15 watts, but it is able to drive the full wattage range, with the compromise being degraded battery life and a louder fan. Next has got to be our current value king, the Valve Steam Deck. Rather than going with off-the-shelf components, Valve worked with AMD to create a custom APU. Its iGPU uses 8 RDNA 2 compute units that boost to a modest 1.6 GHz, but it does cut back a bit on the CPU side, only running 4 Zen 2 cores boosting up to an even more modest 3.5 GHz. For the Steam Deck, the ace up its sleeve is its focus on efficiency, with the customized hardware as well as the integration of SteamOS 3. Here on the channel, we've talked a lot about the up-and-coming devices from the companies like Ayn, Ayaneo, AOK, Zoe, GPD, the whole gamut of things, but we have been more focused on the high end of the spectrum. But today we're going to be shifting more to the low to mid-range of the spectrum with AMD 6600U. The 6600U touts 6 Zen 3 Plus cores on the CPU side and boosts up to 4.5 GHz, so effectively fewer, faster cores than the 5800U. But the main advantage is the update to use the RDNA 2 architecture for its iGPU, utilizing 6 compute units boosting up to 1.9 GHz. Now, none of the companies are actually delivering or sampling any of these 6600U based handhelds, so I had to look around, but I did find a laptop with the Lenovo ThinkBook 13S Gen 4. This laptop uses the same processor, the same speed of memory, as well as the same screen resolution. So I'll make a deal with you guys. If this video gets 200 upvotes, I'll do a quick review of this laptop as well. But today we're going to be focusing on it as an analog to the 6600U based handhelds. All of my testing today is going to be run at 800p, which is the native resolution of the Steam Deck, and I'm going to be focusing more on the low to medium detail settings because that seems to be the sweet spot when it comes to gaming on current generation handhelds. So with that all out of the way, let's see how each of these products stack up with 3D Mark. Night Raid is meant to cover a broad spectrum of hardware as a lower end benchmark, and since we're looking at relatively similar types of hardware, this is a great indicator of how these handhelds are meant to perform. The One X Player Mini with the 5800U performs admirably. It's able to beat the 6600U's GPU score at its lowest spec power rating. Its CPU score is able to surpass all of the other handhelds today, suggesting that the 2 additional cores make it a great emulation handheld. As we know, the Steam Deck's GPU solution is significantly more potent than the 5800U, smoking the One X Player by 34 percentage points, but having half the CPU cores drops its score by 34%. Very convenient. Pivoting to the 6600U, we see 2 sides of the coin. At lower TDPs, the 6600U is barely able to keep up with the Steam Deck and the CPU score, and the GPU just doesn't have the steam to beat the 5800U. Upping the wattage to more of a mid-range value, we are able to rectify both of these issues, surpassing the Steam Deck's CPU score and besting the One X Player Mini by 23%. Increasing the TDP by 5 more watts nets us better performance, but not enough to overtake either category. Firestrike pushes DirectX 11 to the max with very similar scaling across all the devices today. The One X Player Mini starts to show its GPU weaknesses here, with only a minor jump in GPU score, though a 67 percentage point increase in power consumption. Valve's Handheld does very well with the synthetic benchmark, but that CPU score is once again highlighting its critical flaw. With the 6600U, we see excellent CPU scores scaling across the wattage settings, highlighting the Zen 3 Plus improvements from the older generation. On the GPU front, however, we only see a 4 percentage point improvement going to the 25 watt scenario. Not a good indicator for the upcoming budget handheld processor. TimeSpy is similar to Firestrike, except now we're looking at DirectX 12 performance. The Steam Deck and One X Player perform similar to the previous benchmarks, validating our assumptions from before. As for the 6600U, it also replicates the behavior from Firestrike, indicating that the 6600U will optimally perform best at 20 watts. Judging by these synthetic scores, the 6600U has me a little bit worried, so let's see how this translates into real-world gameplay. Starting off with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we see perfect scaling across the board. Nice. Our lower wattage 6600U takes last place with a playable 36 FPS experience, though the One X Player fares slightly better at 39 FPS. For guaranteed 1% lows, upping our wattage to 25 watts on the One X Player gets us up to 43 FPS, and 46 FPS for the 6600U. Luckily, this game is very CPU limited, so the additional wattage unlocks additional FPS for the 6600U. However, the native Linux port and the Steam Deck enjoy a 53 FPS win, so let's see if this carries over into Proton-enabled titles. We're testing Borderlands 3 with DirectX 11 here, and the results compress to a 13 FPS window. The low wattage 6600U barely maintains playable performance, coming in right at 30 FPS. Even with an additional 8 watts, it's still coming in behind the 5800U in its default configuration. It takes 25 watts for the 6600U to be comparable to the 5800U from the previous generations of handhelds. Meanwhile, Lord Gaben's handheld is sitting pretty with a fluid 40-ish FPS experience right out of the box. If you're looking for a high frame rate racing sim, F1 2020 has got you covered. The low watt 6600U can hit a stable 60 FPS, and that's pretty promising, though 1% low frame rates could catch you off guard. Even at 20 watts, the 6600U is still towards the bottom of the pack. The Steam Deck is finally brought down to the middle of the pack, matching the results of the 5800U at 83 FPS. Fortunately though, the 6600U increasing the wattage from 20 to 25 watts nets us a spicy 22% improvement. Pivoting to a more cinematic single-player game, Horizon Zero Dawn humbles our current list of handhelds. Both the 12-watt 6600U and the last generation 5800U come in between 33 and 35 FPS. Though playable, there's a lot left to be desired. The Steam Deck manages a smooth 41 FPS experience, guaranteeing a decent gaming time with a 40 Hz setting or dropping down to a locked 30 FPS. The 6600U finally gets a solid win, outclassing the Steam Deck at 20 watts and adding an additional bit of buffer at 25 watts. GPU-heavy AAA games are a true test for these next-generation handhelds, and this chart illustrates this perfectly. At 12 to 15 watts, both the 6600U and One X Player only managed to maintain just above 30 FPS in the in-game benchmark. Bumping up to 20 to 25 watts nets us a solid experience, with the 6600U maintaining a 40 FPS experience. Here's where things get a little bit messy. What happens when performance straddles a performance target, such as 60 FPS? As for the lower powered options, the 6600U, One X Player, and the Steam Deck hit sub 60 FPS performance, which is less than ideal for this handsome game. But if we go to 20 to 25 watts of APU TDP, we comfortably land above 60 FPS with both the 6600U and the One X Player. With 6 games under our belt, let's check out the averages. At the bottom of the stack, the 6600U at 12 watts is not able to hit 40 FPS on average. This hopefully suggests that a 15 watt variant could perform just above that threshold, so I'll have to test that when I get my hands on a final device. Surprisingly, the 5800U, despite its age, is able to hit above 40 FPS on average, and unfortunately, only achieves 9 percentage points more performance with a drastic 67% increase in power. As I've stated before, the 6600U performs optimally at 20 watts, matching the One X player's 25 watt performance, though falling just short of the Steam Deck. And suppose you want to have a better performance than the Steam Deck? In that case, the 6600U, it can perform better when configured at 25 watts, but consider you are using 67% more power for that privilege. Given our results are just shy of some of our performance targets, is there any additional headroom on these devices to bump us up to the next level? Upscaling technology? Engage. In Forza Horizon 5, engaging the in-game scaling solution to quality mode, we can bump our frame rates by 16%, inching us even closer to 60 FPS. Each handheld can hit 40 FPS at stock settings, except for that 6600U at 12 watts. So regardless, none of the devices can hit 60 FPS, suggesting that we should stick to either low settings or run our monitors at 40 Hz. With Cyberpunk, we have access to AMD's FidelityFX Super Resolution, and we'll be using a couple of different settings. Across the board, we are able to hit 40 FPS at native resolutions, and only the Steam Deck and higher wattage 6600U can hit above 30 FPS. Engaging quality mode with FSR in green, only the One X player and the 12 watt 6600U cannot hit the 40 FPS threshold. Going the extra mile to performance FSR, only the 12 watt 6600U can't perform. However, I do not recommend users engage performance mode in FSR under any circumstance on a handheld, since the internal resolution drops to a meager 400p, turning the screen into a blurry mess. As I was gearing up for this video, I asked you guys over in the community tab what types of games y'all wanted to see played on the 6600U, and one of you guys mentioned to test a little bit of emulation. Unfortunately, I don't have access to a comprehensive library of different emulation titles, but I do have one game that I think shows a pretty good picture. So if you are looking to see just how well the 6600U handles a broad spectrum of games, you're just going to have to sit back and wait until ETA Prime or the Fox presents that video. In the meantime, I tested all three of these devices with the CEMU emulator with the Wii U, and I'm going to be playing a little bit of Breath of the Wild. Here we have each of the devices playing Breath of the Wild with the Wii U emulator. On the bottom right, we have the Steam Deck, and it looks to be running right around 44-45 FPS. At the top right with the One X player, it's running a little bit lower, right around 41. Now, if we use the 6600U with this Lenovo ThinkPad, we're getting right at 42.5 FPS. Now, when we put each of these side by side in an actual game loop at the very beginning of the game, the center screen there is the Steam Deck, and we're getting anywhere in the upper to mid 30s, while the 6600U on the left there is getting right at 35 FPS, and unfortunately the 5800U on the right is only about to get 32 to 34. Now, I will mention when it comes to shader compilation, the Steam Deck definitely starts to struggle and we get some frame skips, whereas both the 6600U and 5800U fare much better. So overall, each of these performs pretty similar to one another, but I do have to give the edge to the Steam Deck, followed closely by the 6600U. Overall, I'm a little bit disappointed with just how well the 6600U is able to perform, and I have to look at it from a couple of different perspectives to come to that conclusion. If you want to run the 6600U in a lower power state, such as 12 or 15 watts, don't expect to get a cutting-edge AAA experience. This could be a decent compromise for those wanting to play indie, older AAA games, or even some decent emulation. If you want to go to the next tier and willing to sacrifice an additional 5 to 8 watts of power, the 6600U really catches its stride at 20 watts. Though this bites battery life considerably, this will grant us performance almost on par with the Steam Deck. That's a 29% performance improvement on average, which is a significant bump for only 8 additional watts of power. If you are looking to beat the Steam Deck, the 6600U is not the droid you are looking for. At 25 watts, you are better off sticking with the 6800U, which typically lands 30% faster than the deck on average at the same wattage. With all that said, here's a couple recommendations. Devices like the Ayn Loki and the lesser equipped Ayaneo Geek 2 tout the 6600U with a TDP target of 15 watts. The Loki matches the Steam Deck's battery capacity, so battery life should be comparable, and it continues to get my recommendation. The only caveat I have with that recommendation is that if you plan to run at 20 watts, I'm just not sure if the Loki is going to be able to cool that device properly. Lastly is the output resolution. Today we tested all of our games at 800p. Unfortunately though, all of these next generation handhelds are running 1900 by 1200 resolutions, so it's not going to be able to perform as well at native resolution. There's a couple different ways to do that. If your game enables FSR inside the engine, definitely engage that, especially if it's using FSR 2.0. But the good news is, since this is RDNA 2, you get access to Radeon Super Resolution, so you'll be able to toggle that in Windows and get FSR running across the board from a driver level. With that setup, the 6600U should be able to maintain the performance numbers we've talked about today, while being visually close enough to 1080p to still enjoy the experience. But as I said earlier, if you want to game at the native resolutions, at least with the heavier titles, you'll need to upgrade to the 6800U. But that's all I have to say about this 6600U. Let me know down in the comments if you guys think I missed anything, or if there's any other tests y'all want to see from this ThinkBook 13S. I have to deliver it to my dad. I bought it as like a belated birthday present, so I don't have access to it for much longer. But let me know down below, or you can catch me over on Twitter at the Turk. I love talking to you guys over there and talking tech and nerdy and memey and all that stuff. But as always, I appreciate y'all sticking to the end of the video. I hope y'all enjoyed it. We'll catch you guys in the next one.